Welcome to Healing Water Project Healing Waters Fly Fishing Thursday. I'm Mike Kelly, and we're covering just kind of a loose presentation tonight. Just covering some of my favorite crappie presentations for mostly for the spring spawning period. So prior to the spawning period, there's a lot of crappie that come up into warmer water, which is shallower and more on the north end of lakes, especially if they're bigger lakes. If there's north coves in those lakes, the south winds blow warmer air over the surface of the water, and that blows up toward the north coves and is kind of trapped there. So you end up with the north coves kind of having warmer water than the southernmost coves. And then inversely, when you have really strange weather in the spring, where you have some north winds, those cold north winds are going to chill the surface of the water, and so that's going to take that cold surface water and pile it up toward the southern end of the lake. So for the most part, in the real early spring, you want to kind of focus on the north end of every lake. That's where the first activity is going to be. But at this time of year, and what I tried a couple of days ago was with some small, very, very tiny jigs. 64th of an ounce, 32nd of an ounce is a big one. And they're tied using rabbit fur and basic fly tying techniques. But I catch a lot of crappie real early when it's too cold to fish. Get out there right at sunup, and that's when they're out there feeding on those midges as they're starting to emerge from the mud and start to come up and try to become adults. So if you can go out to your wherever your local lake is, and just go out in the mornings right about sunup and watch the water. If you can see the water start to just kind of have little dimples in the water, little boils here and there, not big splashy rises like you would see with trout in trout streams. But a lot of times you just see the water just kind of little swirls right as the sun's coming up. That's panfish usually in this area. That's panfish going really on a big feed bag on midges that are emerging from the mud. So when
Mike, you want to spotlight yourself? I'm sorry.
Yeah, when we get we get a little bit closer to probably another couple weeks, we're going to start getting into the period where crappie spawn before bluegills. And when they do, they set up usually around rocks if they're available. So any lakes that have riprap or rocky cover around the shores, they'll be in probably 1 to 6 feet of water usually. And what I've usually seen is the deeper water areas are usually the bigger crappie. The smaller crappie that are closer to 10 inches, maybe 11, possibly a 12, is going to be between 1 and 3 feet of water. If you have 13 and 14-inch crappie in a lake, they're usually not going to be right up in those real shallow rocks. they're going to be a little bit deeper, around closer to 6 feet. So the key to really having a good time during the crappie spawn is flies that, of course, mimic bait fish or large nymphs, because we're after the 10, 11, 12-inch crappies, hopefully. And they're going to be bigger crappies that are not so much feeding on plankton, but they need a little bit bigger of a meal. So they're going to be feeding on bait fish and larger nymphs, maybe damselfly nymphs, dragonfly nymphs if they can find them. But real early in the spring, it's mostly going to be small bait fish and midges. So the first fly we're going to cover, I have a reason for this, but is one of my favorites is the casual dress. This is a Polyrossboro, was a fly tire way back in the 50s, 60s, mostly in the 60s. He wrote a book called Tying and Fishing the Fuzzy Nymphs. This is one of the premier books of fly tying that you can get a hold of. Most people that tie nymphs are really focusing on mayfly nymphs and slender bodies, very streamlined nymphs. But a lot of what Polly Rossborough did was really, he's one of those tires that really focused on the insect he was seeing in the water and trying to recreate it with different tying materials. He lived a simple life. He lived in a trailer behind a gift and tackle shop about 30 miles north of Klamath Falls, Oregon. And when he wasn't fishing, he tied flies from noon until 9, well into his 80s. So most, like his book, Tying and Fishing the Fuzzy Nymphs, he really focused on nymphs that had a lot of movement in the water, whether it was still water in lakes and ponds or in streams. You can tell by the looks of casual dress that there's a whole lot of movement in that fly. This particular fly is two materials other than the thread and the hook: muskrat fur and black ostrich herl. So I'm going to switch cameras here real quick. So I have a black ostrich herl. You can buy patches of muskrat fur. It's usually about 2-inch by 2-inch squares. We'll use the guard hairs and part of the underfur for the tail, and then the underfur is actually used as the dubbing, and then just some thread, and that's it.
Well, what size hook?
So the casual dress is, it could be I believe a 10, size 10 down to maybe a 12.
Okay.
Again, it's normally intended to be a larger nymph, like a stonefly nymph, a larger caddis species, or probably more often a small bait fish.
Mike, is that a 2X hook?
That's a 2X long hook.
Okay.
So this is a patch of muskrat fur. You can tell the guard hairs are kind of sparse, and if you were to get maybe like this patch of muskrat is maybe a little closer guard, you can see a lot more guard hairs in this than this patch. That's a little more sparse. I don't know if that's season or age of the muskrat, but you can't really get much of a tail with just the guard hairs unless you really use use a lot of your patch of fur. But the way I've seen most of these casual dress and the way I've always tied it, if you look at this clump, so I pulled a little clump away from the hide, clipped it right up against the hide, and you can see these longer guard hairs. They're very fine. So I just usually strip those out of there and then grab some of these smaller the fuzz right there, and I'm just going to place that down on the pedestal of my vise. I'm going to use that later, and I'm just kind of trying to slim this down to something that'd be a reasonable tail. If there's a few small guard hairs in there, I don't mind that. And I'm going to take that portion, and that's going to be the tail. So what I didn't do was add my thread. So I'm going to use my other fingers here to hold that down. And I'm going to start a good 2 eye lengths back from the eye of the hook. And the reason is I want to leave myself room, make sure I leave myself room for the ostrich hurl black head of the fly. And so holding my thread at a 90-degree angle, that lets me make those close turns. And then I'm going to clip the waist thread there. So now this is my under fur. I'm going to go about, if you look at the, probably, you could look at it as half of a hook shank length. Quite a bit more than what the gape of the hook is. I'm going to tie that in right at the tail. That's going to give me the tail of this fly. So if you imagine the tail of a minnow, that's what that would represent. So I'm gonna, with this thread, I'm not really going to build up much of a body length, but I don't want any lumps and bumps. So from right there, I'm going to take this fur that I used, that I clipped off. And this is just the under fur from the muskrat. So if you look at this, again, you can see those guard hairs, but then most of this is actually that under fur. And that's what makes excellent dubbing, especially muskrat or beaver. So I'm going to take this clump where you can see all these hairs are pretty much like in the same direction, and try to do this in the camera. I'm going to actually just like grab this and start mixing it up just between my fingers.
What do you mean by mixing it up? You mean just
Oh,
pulling on it
yep.
or twisting
I'm
it?
zoomed in so far that it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just
Let me
trying to understand.
Yeah, let me zoom out a little bit.
Okay. well,
Yeah, I
we
was
go.
gonna say, go ahead and zoom it back out, then
Yeah.
you can zoom in later.
Yep. So I'm just taking this and just kind of just mixing it up
Gotcha.
so they aren't all laying parallel. So now I just have this ball of fuzz in my hand. I'm going to take that. I'm actually going to try to tilt my camera down a little bit so you can see my thread. Now I'm going to take like 5 hairs and some air and start wrapping that onto the thread. So I'm not so much concerned with the thickness of my dubbing noodle here. I just want to get dubbing on the thread. I'm going to start working.
You roll with the
Probably,
twist of the thread, right?
pardon me.
Do you roll with the twist of the thread? You know,
Um,
unless this is an untwisted thread, I don't know.
so this
Go ahead.
thread is actually UTC Ultra thread.
Okay.
It's made up of multiple fibers. You can split this thread if you need to. But I've done this with different threads that are more solid. The key is with any dubbing noodle like this is to use just a few hairs.
Okay. Thank you.
And then you can add on, like right here, I want it to be thicker. I can just add a few hairs onto that on top and just keep twisting. And as long as you twist in the same direction, you're going to end up with a pretty good dubbing noodle. So I've come up here, put a few more hairs. If you try too big of a clump of fur when you're doing a dubbing noodle like this, it's going to end up not adhering to the thread, and it's not going to be a nice solid dubbing noodle. So you can see this as I slide it up. I've got a pretty good solid dubbing noodle. I still have a little bit more dubbing. I'm going to kind of fill in these spots that are a little bit shallow. You can see I only had a few hairs there.
Mhm.
Just keep adding on layers, and you'll end up with a thicker body. If you try to just take a big clump and put it on there, you're never going to be successful. Need to take small groups and just stack them up. Always spin in the same direction. So now with the camera the way it is, I'm going to need to slide this back a little bit. Try doing this. Hopefully my angle is right. So I'm going to come up to the bottom there, and I'm going to start working back to the tail. And once I have that dubbing, you can see I've done like a wrap there to where that dubbing is being held. I'm going to take my bobbin and spin it clockwise. And that's actually going to spin up. I'm going to do like lots of spins clockwise. That's going to take that dubbing and spin it up into a pretty tight rope. So now as I wrap that forward, I have a nice dubbing loop. Now I'm getting toward the front and I'm kind of running out of my dubbing. So I'm going to clip a little bit more off. I'm going to pull those long guard hairs out of there. And then I'm just going to kind of mix that up in my fingers. And just grab a few hairs at a time. Start building it maybe about 2 inches of a dubbing noodle here. Add to it as I need to make it thicker. So much easier to take a thin dubbing noodle and add fibers to it than to try to start with a real fat one. Right here in the middle, it's a little thin. I think I probably have enough there. Start wrapping toward the beginning, toward the eye of the hook. I don't want to go too much further there. So now I'm actually going to, this thread I'm using is 140 denier ultra thread, UTC. And what I'm going to start doing now, since I spun it clockwise so much, I'm going to spin it counterclockwise. And what I want to do is end up making that thread flat. So if you can see where my bodkin is, I'll zoom in a little bit. And
So
move
this is a
back up.
flat thread then? I'm learning. Thank you. I
Yes,
appreciate
yes, it is a
questions.
flat thread. UTC
Okay.
is a flat thread. With 70 denier, it's much harder to split the thread, and that's what I'm going to do here. This is 140 denier, which is a thicker thread. And as you can start to see, that thread's starting to get flat. So I'm just kind of using the flat part of my bodkin. See how that's getting real flat now? So I'm going to take that against my finger. And I'm going to find like a midpoint. It doesn't have to be exact. And I'm going to split that thread. I'm going to go up and down with my bodkin so I've got that split. Now, with my finger in between that, like this, I'm sticking one finger in there so I can kind of separate that. I'm going to take a small section of this muskrat fur. And I'm going to place it in between those two, that split thread. So I've got that clump of hair. Now you can see I've got some long guard hairs and some of those medium guard hairs right in here, and then the under fur. I'm just going to take that and just start carefully spreading that out a little bit. Now, if you start to get to the point where the butts are sticking too far, like this way, you can just kind of tap on them a little bit and even them up a little bit.
Mike, you could probably use a dubbing noodle too, couldn't you? Or
You
a dubbing
could.
loop. Dubbing loop, I'm sorry.
So there's two ways to do this. Either loop your thread over and make a loop a thread, or you can split the thread if you have a heavier thread like this 140 denier. You can split the thread and stick it in there. The advantage of this is that you have less thread bulk. Of course, you have half the thread bulk if you're splitting the thread and putting the fibers in between those. So I'm just going to spread this out just to kind of make those pretty even. And then I'm going to hold it right here. Let me zoom out again. So I'm going to hold my thread right here with my index finger. And then I'm going to take my bobbin and spin it clockwise. And just let it sit there and spin. And then I'm going to let that transfer to that dubbing. Give it another spin. And spin it some more. So now I have this rope, basically, of this muskrat fur. It's almost like a chenille. So I'm going to take that and wrap a collar with that muskrat fur. Now, if I do this right, I'm going to end up at least a eye length behind the eye there. And you can see that muskrat fur collar there. I've pulled a little bit out of there. That's always going to happen when you do a dubbing loop. I'll just move that out of the way. There's a nice full collar right there. And that's kind of the magic of the casual dress, is that fur collar. So now I'm going to take my ostrich herl, and somewhere in the middle here, I'm going to grab a nice long ostrich herl right here. I'm going to cut a little bit off of the base of that because some of those fibers are pretty short. And then I'm just going to tie this in at the head of the fly. Go back a good eye length back. Let me zoom in a little bit better and focus. All right. So I'm going to move that toward the eye just to get it out of the way. And then I'm going to take that ostrich herl and I'm just going to start wrapping, stroke it back, and wrap toward the front. There's a fathead minnow. There's a few different species of minnows where the head is a little bit darker than the rest of the minnow's body. There's also some nymphs, excuse me for bumping the camera. There's also some, I guess I should say larvae, where the front of the worm, if you will, is has a darker head and darker legs. And so that's what that ostrich herl is supposed to represent. So I'm going to take like a wrap. If you saw, I took a wrap over the ostrich herl, and then a little bit in front, another one over the herl, another one in front, and that just kind of traps that in there. So I should be able to nip that out of there and not have it come unglued. So then take my whip finish tool and finish off the head. Whoop.
That'll be something I'll have to learn how to use.
Well, I just ended up breaking my thread because I had it spun so much.
Oh,
So I'm going to use
Bill Bodkin.
to recover, I'm going to use a thinner thread so I don't add too much bulk. And I'll clip all that out of there. Then I will do that over. And I'll show you the whip finish here in a second. Like if you take the end of your whip finish and stick it in tool, stick it in the eye of the hook, it kind of helps support it while you tighten that thread. And then if you're using a gel spun thread, you can just kind of make a little V in your scissors like that.
Mhm.
And just push it against the thread and break it. So that's a casual dress. I'll put a little bit of head cement on there.
That's a really
I
nice
have-
fly, Mike, and
Mhm.
it isn't all that hard to tie.
It's not. I spent a lot of time on it, but it's not that hard to tie.
It might be a good beginner fly.
I think it would be. I was going to put it in the intermediate
Yeah.
because it uses that split thread
Yeah.
dubbing
Yeah.
procedure.
Yeah, that's good because that way we could demonstrate both the dubbing noodle, the dubbing loop
Right.
and the split thread method.
Right.
Okay.
So I'll just make sure there's no glue in that eye. And then I'll actually use this to remove the
Oh, okay.
hook there and stick it on. What I do, I don't know if I showed this before, behind my vise,
Hmm.
I have
Wow.
a little strip of foam that was sticky on one side. And I just hook the fly into that to let it dry.